Okay. I just set this on record, so like every other Zoom session we've had, it's also being recorded and will be posted at some point later on. So I want to talk about today, and we're going to see another documentary connected to this topic. By the way, if you go into Blackboard under course materials, there are a few images or PowerPoints that you can follow along with. But I'll also post them as we go along. In fact, here's the first one. All right, so what we want to talk about today is what happened in Belgium subsequent to the German invasion. Remember, there was the famous von Schlieffen Plan, and the von Schlieffen Plan envisioned dealing with a two-front war, one front in the west, the other in the east against Russia, the one in the west against France. But according to the plan that was devised by the general, Alfred von Schlieffen, back in 1904, that would require moving German troops through Belgium, through the Kingdom of Belgium. And Belgium then was an independent country, it was a sovereign nation, and it was a neutral country. It had no alliances. It had an agreement that we'll talk about with the British to protect them, but there were no alliances. And Belgium would not have taken either side in World War I because they were neither in the Triple Alliance nor the Triple Entente, and they were basically a violated nation, but they were not really amongst the Central Powers, so the Germans, the Austrians, and the Ottoman Turks, nor were they with the Allies, right? They were, unfortunately, like I said, just a victim as a result of history and geography, right? So you see this map, there's the Kingdom of Belgium, and you'll note north of Belgium are the Netherlands, or Holland. To the south is France, and that's why the Germans had to plan their attack going through Belgium, because most of the French troops were positioned in the northern part of France near the Belgian border. Then, of course, to the east is the German Empire. Let's speak a bit about the history of Belgium. Very interesting little country, very beautiful little country. I've spent a great deal of time there because I used to have a lot of family in Belgium, less family now, unfortunately, but it was at least a yearly or twice a year visit to Belgium. And one of the things that struck me in traveling around were all of the unending World War I memorials in Belgium, but for good reason. Then, of course, there are the World War II memorials, because in that war, the Germans invaded and occupied Belgium once again. So what's the story of this country? What is Belgium all about? For the longest time, and I think I mentioned this the last time, Belgium actually was not an independent country. It only really gained its independence in 1839, and was very often the sort of the spoils of war, ended up under the control of one country or another. I guess the most significant development in that regard is what happened at the end of the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte. So you might be familiar with the Napoleonic Wars, carried on for a very long time, spread all the way across Europe, all the way into Russia. But then in the West, of course, Napoleon, he had some big victories. In 1805, the Battle of Austerlitz was a major victory for Napoleon. And he thought he was invincible. He was just moving all across the continent. But ultimately, his day of reckoning came in the year 1815. What happened in 1815? You're probably familiar with this, the Battle of Waterloo. Waterloo was where Napoleon was finally defeated by a coalition of the Dutch and the British. 1815, Battle of Waterloo. Waterloo is actually is located in Belgium. It's in Belgium. Now, when Napoleon was defeated in 1815, The question is, what's going to happen to this piece of real estate known as the Kingdom of Belgium? The British and the Dutch obviously didn't want this to go to France. And they did everything they could to make sure it didn't go to France. What they did is it became part of Holland, it became Southern Holland. So now the Dutch controlled the Kingdom of Belgium. And it's interesting, they're both very small countries, right next to each other, but they're so different, culturally, religiously, historically. Holland, or the Netherlands, same thing, is predominantly a Protestant country. And if you know anything about the Protestant Reformation and Erasmus from Rotterdam and all those stories, that is the predominant religious faith of Holland. Belgium, on the other hand, is predominantly a Catholic country. Holland, or the Netherlands, the official language is Dutch. Dutch is a language that comes from what's known as Plattdeutsch, Low German. Now, it's not a value judgment. Low meaning geographically. I actually have a PhD in German literature. Along the way in grad school, I had to study the history of the German language. So, see what I can remember. Germany stretches from the North Sea, all the way south to the Alps. North, the dialect and the pronunciation of Northern German, let's say in Hamburg and so on, is unique and different from, let's say, the German of Bavaria, Bayern, in the south. So when we speak about Plattdeutsch, or Low German, it means from the lowlands, the north. Those are flatlands. Hochdeutsch, or the High German, is from the south, from the Alpine region, where the mountains are. Dutch sounds more like Plattdeutsch, Low German, because if you look at the map, you can see Holland is on the border, or the other side of the border, from the northern part of Germany. So Dutch is a Low German, Low Germanic language. In Belgium, on the other hand, the official language is Flemish. Flemish sounds very much like Dutch. I mean, the vocabulary is very much like Dutch, very much like German with certain consonant changes, but it sounds very different. It's a much more guttural language. And not only that, but Belgium, because of its history and location, has two official languages and one not so official language. In the part of Belgium that abuts the North Sea, the main port there is Antwerpen, right? That area is predominantly Flemish speaking. The capital of Belgium is Brussels, and the area around Brussels is predominantly French speaking. And then there's an area of Belgium sort of to the northeast that borders Germany, where the predominant language is actually German. So Belgium is officially a bilingual country, but in fact, unofficially, it's a trilingual country. So very different from Holland. Culturally, when you think of the arts, for example, of the two countries, you think of Holland and Rembrandt, right? Very distinctive style. And then if you think of Belgium, the Flemish school of art, Van Eyck and Van Dyck, and all these guys, very different style of art. So very different cultural orientations between these two countries. So now, getting back to the Battle of Waterloo and the defeat of Napoleon, Belgium is now part of Holland. But the Belgian people weren't really happy with that. You know, no one wants to be dominated by another nation. That's basically what brought around World War I to begin with. Remember, the Bosnian Serb and his group of the Black Hand, who didn't want to be under the control of Austria, right, started a whole war, Well, Belgium didn't want that either. And so already in 1830, the Belgians started revolting against Dutch control. And by 1839, the Belgians achieved independence and became a separate kingdom, Kingdom of Belgium. And here it is, situated in a very precarious neighborhood. The Germans on one side, the French there, the Dutch on the other side, very dangerous place. In 1839, a treaty was signed called the Treaty of London, 1939. And in that treaty, Belgian sovereignty was guaranteed. Belgium was guaranteed its status as a unique and separate, bounded, bordered nation. And even the Prussians, and Prussia was then, this is before the German Empire, but Prussia was the most powerful and the largest of the German-speaking states, and even the Prussians signed on. And of course, the British signed on, and the French signed on. So Belgium, although they had their doubts, at least on paper, felt that they were safe and secure from an invasion. The British, on the other hand, were always nervous because Belgium is the only country that stands between Germany and England. If you look at the map, there's Germany, there's Belgium, there's the North Sea, or the British Channel, English Channel, and then there's England. So the British had their own interest in making sure that Belgium was safe and sound to protect it from a possible invasion by the Germans. So everything looked all right. The Belgians got their independence. They got their guarantees of support and protection from the Treaty of London in 1839. But there was always the problem and the potential for an invasion of Belgium because of that von Schlieffen plan. And the Belgians knew it. So when World War I suddenly rolled around, the Belgian king first asked the French if they would respect the border of Belgium. The French said yes, they would not invade Belgium. When the Germans were asked, they hesitated, and they were not so quick to guarantee the sovereignty of Belgium, because after all, they had their war plan, and they knew exactly that they had to go through Belgium. So what happened was, the issue arose: would other countries come to the aid of Belgium and go to war against Germany? Because after all, there's a treaty, Treaty of London, to which the German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, said, it's just a scrap of paper. No one's going to go to war over a scrap of paper. Well, they were wrong. Right? And when the German army, in its pincer movement in the West, went straight through the northern part of Belgium on the way to Paris, the Belgian kingdom, Belgian nation, was now suddenly under siege and at the mercy of really brutal German troops. So the question is, again, what was going to happen? Well, obviously the British had an interest and a scrap of paper, as it were, and the British came in and said, yes, we will defend Belgium. Right? It's a violation of the Treaty of London. So what did this all lead to? Right? Not a pretty situation. What happened in 1914, when the German army came into Belgium, the atrocities that were committed were so brutal that became known in history, that German invasion became known in history as the Rape of Belgium. And we'll talk about why it was designated that way, partially for propaganda purposes. And we'll see what the propaganda was on both sides. The truth is, on both sides, there was a bit of exaggeration, right? But not much, right? It was a really horrible situation. So this rape of Belgium refers to the mistreatment of the Belgian nation, its civilians, right? Civilians by German troops. Now, you have to keep in mind that Belgium in 1914 had a total population of 7.5 million. Between the French army and the German army, there were about 30 million troops. So, I mean, just the mere military force of France and Germany could have just walked in and wiped out Belgium. It was more than 4 times the size. Its military combined was more than 4 times the size of all of Belgium altogether. That's why they were eager to get the agreement of the French and Germans to not invade. The French said, "We won't touch you," but the Germans, backed off and made it clear that they didn't answer directly, but it was clear from their non-answer that they were going to go through Belgium. What was the total size of the Belgian army? About 123,000 compared to all these tens of millions. It was a new country. It was a small country. It felt somewhat secure because of this treaty. So it didn't ever build up a huge or dominant military force. And that became very clear when the war broke out and the Germans just went rolling through on their tanks and everything else. And the Belgians basically were on bicycles, whatever, and didn't even have proper army uniforms. They were most of them were in civilian uniforms. The king of Belgium, Albert I, King Albert I, was in a rather strange situation. Why? Who was Albert I? And if you move down on the PowerPoint, there he is, King Albert I of Belgium. King Albert I was of German origin. He was from the House of Saxe-Coburg in Saxony, Germany. Originally, that was the family that he came from. By the way, the British also were descended. The royals in Britain, the king, was also descended from Saxe-Coburg. So why is the House of England known as the House of Windsor? For that reason. They didn't want to be associated with Germany after World War I. They changed the name. Right. So all of these guys, obviously, historically, always all related. But King Albert of Belgium was himself of German origin, of German royalty, and his wife was also of Wittelsbach, from Bavarian aristocracy. So the family was German by descent, but he's now the king of Belgium. And where were his loyalties going to go? And he said very clearly, law takes precedence over family. I might be related to the Kaiser of Germany, to the Emperor of Germany, but I'm the king of Belgium. And as the king of Belgium, I signed an agreement, right? The Treaty of London. And therefore law trumps family bloodlines. And he had to then make it perfectly clear, notwithstanding his relationship, he has to stand up for the Belgian people. And indeed, he took command of the Belgian forces. And his son was a foot soldier in the Belgian army in World War I. Obviously, the odds were stacked against the Belgians. How could they possibly fight off the invading army of Germany with all of its numbers of soldiers and its advanced tanks and everything else it had? Well, actually, the tanks were not that advanced yet. That comes later on. But they still had these primitive forms of tank and, of course, all of the other weapons at their disposal. The Belgians basically had bicycles and horseback. So it was a lost cause. And when it became clearly a lost cause, the King of Belgium and his ministers packed up all the important papers in the Belgian ministries, put them into different cartons and so on, and then onto lorries, and they moved them out of Belgium, right, across the border into France. So the initial phase of the von Schlieffen Plan and the First World War took place, obviously, on the grounds of the Kingdom of Belgium, and didn't go well for the Belgians, to put it mildly. But it's not just that the Germans came in, took over, occupied. What they did in Belgium was totally reprehensible. And that's what we're going to talk about, how the German army brutalized, murdered, raped, pillaged the Belgian civilian population. This wasn't even an action against the military. This was a war against the civilian population of Belgium. And I might add in passing, just as a footnote, sort of a model or an allusion to what the Germans were going to do in World War II, only worse. Right? So what happened in World War I was the template, right, sort of the model for German actions in World War II, only upgraded many times. So let's get back to the status of Belgium. According to this treaty, Belgium was a neutral country, right? Signed that treaty. The Prussians signed that treaty also. But the von Schlieffen Plan required otherwise, and Belgium was invaded. The atrocities committed were numerous in their ferocity and in terms of what actually happened. But basically what happened was the civilian population and the infrastructure of Belgium were destroyed by the Germans. I might add that at that point in time, Belgium, believe it or not, had was one of the top 6 economies in the world. Because even though it was a little country, it was highly industrialized, and Belgium had overseas territory, including one very controversial and quite immoral holdings in Africa, the Belgian Congo. The Belgian Congo is no longer called the Belgian Congo because somewhere in the 1960s it gained its independence. I think it's now known as Zaire. But what was important about the Belgian Congo was that in Katanga province, in Leopoldville, one of the areas in the Congo, one found the largest and most desirable diamond mines. And of course, the diamonds were exploited by the Belgians. Belgium itself is like a minuscule country in comparison to the size of the Belgian Congo. But the Belgians came in, it's now their colony, and of course exploited the natural resources, primarily the diamonds, which is why to this very day, the diamond industry in Belgium, especially in the city of Antwerpen, is a major industry because historically those diamonds were shipped back to Belgium where they were cut and polished. And so that industry grew up in Belgium in the 19th century and continues to this day to be a major economic aspect of Belgian life. So the Belgians were, for their size, pretty successful country. When World War I ended, they were no longer, nor ever again, a major industrial country because, like I said, the Germans exploited it. You'll see exactly how. So what happened? Basically, when the Germans came in, they decided, for whatever reason, that the civilian population of Belgium was a threat. That even though there were civilians, either they were local terrorists, they call them French franc tireur. Franc tireur means free terrorists, like they were actually working for the government or the army, even though they were dressed in civilian clothing, or they were spies, or they were actual soldiers, military men who were disguised as civilians. So that was the main justification why the Germans could, just fortuitously kill off any citizens of Belgians they wanted. So as a result, 6,000 Belgian citizens were killed, 17,000 Belgians died as they tried to escape the country. Another 3,000 Belgians lost their lives through the Germans set up electrified fences to make sure that they couldn't escape. And many of them, 3,000, became electrocuted as they tried to get through the lines. In addition to that, the Germans took 120,000 forced laborers. 60,000 of that number they sent back to Germany to work in the factories. The other 6,000 they forced into labor in Belgium. But the Germans also sent back to Germany all of the heavy equipment, all the machinery that was to be found in the Belgian, in the Belgian factories, which is why Belgium never again recovered to become a great industrial power. In addition to that, the Germans destroyed 25,000 homes and other buildings in 837 different communities throughout Belgium. The population of Belgium, I told you, at the time was about 7.5 million. Basically, 20%, 1/5 of the entire population of Belgium fled the country and tried to get out and escape. That included, by the way, the king, Albert himself, and his ministers, who managed to get out and leave Belgium. Of course, that led to, later on, after the war, a great unemployment crisis. Industries were looted by the Germans, and that was only part of the overall problem. Now, what was happening in Belgium obviously became known throughout the world. It was, in all the, here you have German atrocities. See the German army just executing a number of citizens, not military, whatever. So when the word got out, and it did, of what was going on, obviously there's a great propaganda potential, especially in England. Why? Because even though the British, at least on the surface, seemed to go to war without much doubt, or without many questions, the truth is there were, amongst the proletariat and amongst the working classes, they weren't 100% sure going to war was a necessary thing, and why should Britain get involved, and who needs this whole thing because some guy was shot to death in Sarajevo. So this way, the British can manipulate public opinion and sympathy for the war by focusing on what was going on in Belgium and sort of leaving the assassination of Sarajevo to the side. Because once word got out and all of the reports came out and the photos came out and the survivors' eyewitness accounts came out, this made for great newspaper print. And so all of the atrocities committed appeared in British newspapers, and for that matter, in American newspapers as well. And the result of that was now there was more of a general feeling in England that the British were correct and they were justified in going to war, because look what these Huns, these barbarians, these Germans are doing to the Belgians, innocent people. So now it became a moral obligation to fight against Germany. But unfortunately, as is usually the case, like I said, this makes for great newsprint. And so some of the atrocities were further embellished. And stories about nuns that were being raped and hanged from trees, and I mean, all kinds of things. This is not to say that rape didn't occur and that all this murder didn't occur, but some of the lurid details were really beyond the pale, or beyond what was real. They just added on to the whole story to make it even more dramatic and to cast the Germans even worse than they were. And again, for the government to now find justification for what they were doing by sending these, troops, young troops, off to fight the Germans. So the propaganda, but there were propagandists on the other side too. What the Germans did to counter it, they showed all kinds of pictures of German soldiers giving chocolate to little Belgian children and so on. Again, maybe there was a case or two of that. That was hardly, the norm. It's not really the way the Germans behaved, but both sides used the press and propaganda for their own particular purposes. Remember, World War I was the first total war. Total meaning it was right there in your front yard, and everyone was involved in it one way or another. And so using the press, using newspapers had tremendous impact on the way people perceived what was going on. And so the later analysis of this whole thing showed that the British press overdid it a bit and maybe made it even worse than it already was. It was bad enough, but here they've made it even more dramatic and more horrid than need be. So what were the specific, or what were the particular crimes? What were the war crimes that were committed? Well, like I said, it was victimization of civilians, and German troops, being afraid that there were these Belgian guerrilla warriors out there, fighters, decided they would just burn their homes down and shoot them, execute them, and this went throughout Belgium. And this included men, women, and children. Germans didn't distinguish. If they had any doubt or any, concern that someone was actually going to be a danger to them, they just started firing away. Amongst the cultural horrors of the German invasion, I think I mentioned this once before, there was a famous, very old Catholic university in the town of Leuven. Leuven is the Flemish word for the French Louvain. Beautiful university. And I've been there a number of times. It's beautiful medieval architecture, and it had, at the time, probably the largest collection of medieval manuscripts anywhere. It was it's a beautiful small Belgian town. It had then a population of 10,000. But it had this huge library, and it had about 300,000 medieval handwritten manuscripts. For no reason, the Germans burnt the library down. And they burnt parts of the university down. And they burnt private homes down. And basically, they sacked Louvain. Then it was the industrial dismantlement. Like I said, they dismantled all of Belgian industry. They either sent 60,000 forced laborers back to Germany to work, another 60,000 they kept there, but they kept sending back all of the machinery from all the Belgian factories and so on. Their whole industrial complex was destroyed and sent away by the German army to enhance German industrialization, and the forced laborers to make up for these men now having to leave the factory to go to the fight on the battlefield. And the concern or the motivation of the Germans was to make sure that their industry was not in any way undermined by this war. So the death toll, as I said, there are different accounts, but certainly were at least 6,000 Belgians killed, basically about 24,000 altogether, 6,000 outright killed, another 18,000 killed during the expulsion when they tried to leave the country, and then there were the other incidents, the electrified fences and so on and so forth. There were injuries and accidents along the way, accounted for another a few thousand, and then of course many died of disease. And then some just disappeared. They went missing, and they were not accounted for ever later on. So the initial phase of World War I, the real victim was Belgium and its citizens. And what that led to was worldwide outrage. If you look at the next PowerPoint, these are two of the relief advertisements. What happened was after the war, and actually for that matter, even during the war, when word got out about what was happening in Belgium, there were different organizations that were set up to help the Belgians get back on their feet. The one on the right is obviously a British one, Remember Belgium, and buy bonds and so on. And the monies would be used, for reestablishing life in Belgium, try to bring it back from where it was. This first one on the left is, actually it's written in German, Im Kugelregen, in the rain of bullets, right? This is with our guard in the enemy land, right? But this is a post-war, I guess, attempt to help out the Belgians who they'd already basically destroyed during the war. In America, word got out, and the Americans are outraged. The truth is that what the Germans did in Belgium was one of the first steps towards America moving slowly towards becoming involved in World War I. The Americans wanted no part of World War I. America was an isolationist country. We'll talk more about it when we get to the American entry. But America was separated on both sides by a big ocean, wanted no part of European politics or battles or anything else for that matter. We were happy to stay at home and wanted no part. The president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, actually ran for a second term on the motto, he kept us out of war, right? But that was 1916. But ultimately, the Germans created a situation where slowly animosity, hatred, and resentment of the Germans built up. And even in America, this great isolationist nation, it was too much. But Americans first put together a relief agency to help the Belgians recover, and was headed by a Midwestern banker by the name of Herbert Hoover. He later became the president of the United States. He had the misfortune of being president during the Great Depression, so he will never be remembered as, you know, a particularly positive figure because of the suffering that America had to endure because of that depression. Nevertheless, he was the figure who is associated with the American relief program to help the Belgians out. Just as an aside, right, a digression for a second. So about 6 months ago, there's a major British publisher, Rowan Littlefield, published very scholarly works, mostly having to do with history. And they asked me to review a book, a manuscript that someone sent in about the relief program, Herbert Hoover's relief program, Belgian relief. So I said, sure. Yeah. And they said, okay, if you would, then we're going to give you a $100 gift certificate. You can buy any book you want that we publish. So I reviewed it. I said, yeah, it's a very interesting subject and very well treated. So, but in my opinion, I wouldn't publish it. And I said, why? There are two reasons why. One, you'll see why I didn't give. But one reason I said, you know, it's a very interesting and very significant sort of development within World War I, but I don't think it's the sort of a topic that's going to attract much attention. I think most people are interested in the American relief effort. The other reason, which I do think, is because your book's so damn expensive, no one's going to buy it. Right? I couldn't say that. Anyway, so that was my conclusion. And then 2 weeks ago, I got an email from the publisher saying, thank you so much for your review. I want you to know that the book is coming out in 2 weeks. We're sending you a free copy. So, like always, I give my opinion, and everyone decides they're going to do whatever they want anyway. But that's just an aside. So that was Herbert Hoover, and that was the American relief attempt to help out the poor Belgians when the war moved on. They lacked food and clothing, and of course their industry was destroyed, and there was rampant illness and everything else. And Americans, when they heard about it, Americans are very charitable people and very sensitive to these sorts of things. And a movement arose to see what it was shortly when I played the documentary on the atrocity in Belgium. But that was our attempt to help out this embattled nation, which had been basically under the thumb or under the boot, I guess, of Germany. So I want now to switch to the documentary footage, and we'll see if this time after to sort of segue into the next topic. And yeah, this one. Yeah.
Belgium in the summer of 1914. Belgium, the route of the German invader. A nation of bystanders, neutral by treaty and tradition, it has been swept up into war by Germany's Schlieffen Plan, a right hook aimed at France through Belgium. Neutrality has been brushed aside as a scrap of paper. The forts of Liège have been taken in battle. Next target, Brussels, the capital. After this, of Belgium's 3 major cities, only Antwerp will remain. Each victory leaves one less sanctuary for the refugee. On August 20th, General Alexander von Kluck's First German Army occupies Brussels. A parade of power. 3 days, 3 nights. 300,000 jackbooted troops tramping across the cobblestone. Even after the battle has moved on to France, this cadence will echo through the world. Aggression, occupation, atrocity. The Belgian army in retreat, antiquated and makeshift, but still defiant. For the German High Command, the resistance is incomprehensible, bordering on the insane. In the face of massive odds, Albert, King of the Belgians and Commander-in-Chief, has refused to surrender, ignoring all ultimatums. Instead, he falls back from Brussels toward fortified Antwerp. Here, he hopes to hold out until help arrives. In England, the invasion of Belgium is the issue that unified public opinion in favor of war. Little Belgium and the scrap of paper are already rallying cries in the campaign to recruit volunteers. But in truth, the help available is insignificant. The only major power in Europe without conscription, Britain musters but 6 divisions. And, says the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, no landings can be made in Belgium itself. The fleet can guarantee safe passage only across the Channel to France. British Expeditionary Force, Sir John French commanding, arrives on the continent with 80,000 troops and 30,000 horses. It is, in the words of a military historian, the best trained, best organized, and best equipped army that ever went forth to war. Perhaps so, but certainly it is not the best informed. As it moves toward the front in a convoy of London buses, intelligence estimates the German strength in its sector at 17 divisions. Actually, General Kluck has 30. The only British plan is commitment, to join France in battle against the Germans. The battleground is Belgium. There, the BEF takes up its position. On the left of the French Fifth Army, under General Charles Lorison. At Mons, the British and German paths converge. No better informed than the British, the Germans have heard only rumors of the BEF's arrival, are astonished to see the English on their front. The armies collide by accident. For 48 hours, the British hold their ground, until the French army suddenly withdraws, exposing the British flank. Now, there is no alternative. The BEF gathers its bloodied remnant and heads back down the road it had come up only 2 days before. The Belgians must stand alone. The Belgians have won for themselves the immortal glory which belongs to a people who prefer freedom to ease, security, and life itself. So writes the British Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, as Antwerp prepares for siege. By draining the country of all available manpower, the Belgians have raised an army of 117,000, an operetta army in patent leather helmets and Napoleonic uniforms. But what the world senses, if Germany does not, is that this is not just an army, but a people. The German command, stung and exasperated by the unexpected defiance of the Belgians, detaches a powerful segment of Kluck's right wing and swings it north to crush the resistance at Antwerp. As the Belgians deploy to meet the German thrust, civilians come out to the lines to watch. In these young days of the war, battle is still a spectator sport. At first, the incredible happens. The Belgians hold. But then the Germans bring up their siege guns, the guns that broke the forts of Liège. At this moment of crisis, a smiling, cherubic Englishman arrives in Antwerp by sea. Winston Churchill, 39 years old. Close on his heels in London buses, a detachment of Royal Marines. Only 400. But Churchill intimates that they are merely the vanguard of thousands more. few days, Belgium loses the feeling of utter loneliness in a hostile world. But even as the British move toward the battle line, word comes that the promised reinforcements have been ordered home, back to Britain. Compassion must be tempered by realism. The government cannot spare troops for a cause that seems hopeless. Only 400 British come to Antwerp. Antwerp, the target for Kluck's big gun. Skoda 305mm mortar. Monstrous Krupp 420, the Big Bertha. 1,800-pound shells slam into the city. Under fire in Antwerp, King Albert and his queen, Elizabeth, become the symbols of Belgian resistance. Queen's role is a difficult one. Her brother is a general in the German army. On October 9th, after a month of siege, Albert accepts the inevitable. Official archives packed in wicker. Government and army abandon Antwerp for exile in France. In a final gesture of bravado, the Belgians outmaneuver Kluck and safely cross the frontier. With the troops, on the roads and at the ports, the refugees. In later years, when asked how historians will assess the guilt for World War I, a French premier, Clemenceau, will answer. I know one thing they will not say. They will not say that Belgium overran Germany. In the long retreat from Liège to Antwerp, the Belgians have been denuding their country of everything the enemy can use. To win a few days, a few hours, they deliberately sacrifice the entire transportation network of the country. As invasion settles into occupation, resistance takes other forms. There is sporadic activity by civilian snipers. Fearful and indignant, the Germans collect hostages. Terror is a proper method to shorten war. So wrote Clausewitz, the German voice of military wisdom. The army has read its Clausewitz. An army of occupation. The Germans appoint a field marshal, Baron von der Goltz, to head it. Later, he will be succeeded by Baron von Bissing. Now, every aspect of Belgian life is controlled by proclamation. Death for snipers. Cities under curfew. Confiscation. The iron fist for Belgium. It is the duty of the occupying power to feed the population. So the nations of the world have agreed by treaty. But the Belgians cannot eat the parchment of a treaty, and the Germans see to it that they get little else. Livestock and wheat are confiscated. Farm workers are marched off to forced labor in Germany. The German army, proudly proclaimed the best disciplined military force in history, literally debauches itself on the country of Belgium, the conqueror enjoying his spoil. A Belgian city, sacked and set afire by the Germans, becomes the very image of atrocity. Louvain. The world's lost. A beautiful medieval town with a treasured library that had taken centuries to collect and can never be replaced in all the centuries to come. London in the autumn of 1914. If the German General Staff is scornful of world opinion, Britain is not. The Belgian atrocity stories are publicized to the world by the British Propaganda Office. Some stories are true, some are myth. Lord James Bryce, a diplomat and author with a large following in America, will lend his name to a report that catalogs all the alleged outrages and gives them all, true and false, a stamp of authenticity. The world press is even more lurid. The most ghastly images deal with atrocities against children and nuns. Most are pure fabrication. The Germans provide Britain with their richest propaganda windfall by executing Nurse Edith Cavell for helping British prisoners to escape. The Germans call her a spy. The world remembers her only as a woman. Berlin's counter-propaganda is ill-planned and clumsy. These are German propaganda films, purporting to show happy Belgians feasting and fraternizing with the occupation army. This is reality, with winter, starvation in Belgium. With the situation desperate, a group of wealthy Belgians approaches the military government with a plan to purchase food abroad. Unexpectedly, The Germans agreed. The world's conscience is touched. Now, will England lift its naval blockade and let the food ships pass? The American chosen to head the newly created Committee for Relief in Belgium, Herbert Hoover, finally wrings the necessary approval from London. Hoover visits Belgium, confers with King Albert in France. A worldwide campaign for Belgian relief is organized. Nowhere does the campaign catch hold as in America. The American people adopt Belgian relief as their personal charity. In the cause of charity, opera singer Amalika Galli-Curci sells apples on a New York street corner, and actress Lillian Gish makes speeches. Relief Administrator Hoover estimates the need at 150,000 tons of food a month, and he is ready to deliver. The Germans live up to their end of the agreement. Relief ships are guided through minefields into the ports of neutral Holland. By agreement between enemies, starving Belgium is fed. It will be one of the few times in this long, cruel war when the cry of humanity is answered. After Belgium, it will be all but impossible for America to take the side of Germany in World War I. An image has been stamped on the world's conscience, an image that Germany will not live down, and that, in a later generation, Germany will live up to.
Okay, I don't know why the documentary suddenly had subtitles. It's in English to begin with, and the subtitles, when they tried to capture German names, were ludicrous, absurd. Obviously, couldn't, they had no idea what to put, so General von Kluck became a clerk, and so on and so forth. But I think it's a pretty good overall view of what happened in Belgium, sadly. And as I said at the end, what is going to happen in World War II, this is like just a sort of dress rehearsal compared to the atrocities that are going to be suffered later on during the Second World War by the invasion of the German army and the occupation of Belgium amongst virtually every other country in Europe before it's all over with. So this is the situation. The war just began. So I think we already spoke about the Battle of the Marne. If we didn't, I'm going to mention it briefly in the next segment that we do, because it's going to lead into the next topic, which is of course the trench warfare that characterized World War I. But already we have an unfortunate situation with the civilian population being victimized, and this is not going to be the first or last time in the course of World War I, where atrocities are even magnified far beyond what you just saw in Belgium. That's going to be the situation in the Republic of Armenia when the Ottoman Turks, who are on the side of the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, when the Ottoman Turks unleash the century's first genocide and wipe out in the process over 1 million Armenians in ethnic cleansing, basically, which takes place in the course of the war in the Middle East. We'll talk about the war in the Middle East separately. Obviously, it's a unique aspect and part of the war as well. What's going to happen with Winston Churchill? All right, he's the First Lord of the Admiralty. Didn't do too well in his attempts to help the Belgians out in the beginning. He's going to suffer an even worse catastrophe in the Middle East, the Battle of Gallipoli, which was a horror story for the British and almost ended his military career. Fortunately for the world, he is a person who never gave up, and he's back to lead the British nation in World War II. Basically, if it weren't for Winston Churchill, who knows how World War II would have played out. But obviously, brilliant tactician, someone who really had his finger on the pulse of what Germany was all about. And fortunately, he was able to convince a very skeptical British Parliament to rearm and take up arms against the Germans in World War II. Very, very, very interesting individual. We'll speak more about him as time goes on. He's one of my heroes of history. And so that's Winston Churchill now, World War I, and this will be a very important Winston Churchill in World War II. As far as what happened in Belgium, I would suggest there are a number of books, but this particular one, it's on the bibliography list that you have with the syllabus. It's by Larry Zuckerman, called The Rape of Belgium, The Untold Story of World War I. And there are other publications as well, but I think this is probably the best in terms of capturing exactly what the Germans did. Now, again, this German atrocity in Belgium obviously cast the Germans in a certain light, in a negative light, not enough to make America go to war. But there can be a couple of other incidents along the way that finally are going to push America to break with its isolationism and go to war, declare war in April of 1917. And we're going to speak about those. Okay, Belgium was this incident, but then comes the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which was a passenger ship, also not a military vessel and not carrying soldiers or anything, it was tourists. So that was sinking of the Lusitania. Then we're going to talk about the famous or infamous Zimmermann telegram, a telegram that was intercepted where the German government offered certain compensations to the Mexicans if they would declare war against the United States. This way, the Germans figured it would keep the Americans out of the war. They're too busy with Mexico. But fortunately, that telegram was intercepted. And on it goes. And the most important, I guess, development was unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans refused to give up their submarine attacks against commercial vessels and passenger ships and so on. These are not military vessels. And finally, their failure to abide by an agreement, or at least at some point they said, okay, we'll cease this submarine warfare, but they didn't. And then there was the famous bombing of Black Tom Island off the coast of Staten Island, and by the Germans, and other German acts of terrorism in the United States, actually, during World War I. Finally, the Americans were pushed to the limits and decided to declare war. And we'll talk about it, obviously, when we get to it, but then we entered World War I in April of 1917. So that's where we're leading off. For the next time, we're going to go on with the most important, one of the most important aspects militarily of World War I, and that's trench warfare. But first, I'd like to ask a question, nothing to do with the class. Just wanted sort of general response, so I can decide what to do. The other day, I received an email saying, asking me if I'd like to teach a winter session course. I always do, and it's always online. But apparently, in this winter session coming up, everything is going to be hybrid. I've never done a hybrid class before, but everything's hybrid. And so these are the options. I can either appear on campus twice a week for an hour and a quarter, or once a week for 2.5 hours. So let me ask you as students, if you were taking a winter course, you have no other options now, everything is hybrid. Would you rather come once a week for 2.5 hours or twice a week for an hour and a quarter? Any feelings about that? So I can decide which option to take. Once a week or twice a week? Anyone? Yeah, once a week. Really? Okay. Even though the once a week is 2.5 hours. Yes, once a week. Anyone else? Okay, I'll keep that in mind. I was not sure which. I mean, the truth is, it's the winter and it's cold, and who knows what's going on out there. So I can see the once a week, even though the once a week is pretty long. And then one follow-up question. Being that winter semester courses cost more, and now you haven't got the option of totally online, how many of you would actually consider taking a winter course this year? Anyone? Should I take your silence as a no, or what's anyone? Okay, so we will, oh, you would take, okay, good. So we will meet again on Thursday, same time, same place, and start discussing trench warfare in World War I. I don't know how far we'll get, but there is a documentary that goes, many actually, but there's one documentary that we have that goes along with the whole issue of trench warfare, and that's coming up in the next class. Take care, stay safe, be well, see you on the computer come Thursday.
Thank you.
All right, you too, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Stay safe.